In my last conversation with the journalist Arwa Damon on this podcast, she told me that one of the reasons there is such a fractious debate around Israel's war in Gaza is because she felt that if a state calls itself a democracy, that title brings with it a set of obligations to act and behave in a way that would befit the title. Now, whether or not you agree with Arwa, I think the conflict in Gaza has become something of a lightning rod for debates around the existing world order, what it is, what it should be, maybe even whether it exists. But that's also true for the conflict in Ukraine, which we've also discussed on the podcast. In both cases, the US and its allies are supplying weapons to one of the sides, but the narrative around each conflict is very different, and certainly initially sparked all manner of debate and opinion pieces and podcast episodes. And while those debates have ebbed and flowed, they have obscured some of the other conflicts taking place around the world. And while some of those might be less of an ideological touchstone for the Western world than the wars in Ukraine and Gaza, they're no less devastating for those affected. As always, on the last Friday of every month, the lead hosts Global Insights, the current affairs show presented by my colleague Kwangu Liwewe. And this month, Kwangu, who joins me now, wanted to redress that lack of coverage of one of those other conflicts, the civil war in Sudan, which has just passed its second anniversary. Kwangu, thanks for coming on. This conflict, the Sudanese civil war, I think a lot of people will have heard of, but perhaps they know very little about it. How, with that in mind, how did you approach this episode?
Thanks, Faisal. I think one of the big problems is that the conflict, which is complex as so many other conflicts are on the continent, including the one in the DRC, it tends to be dumbed down for international audiences. And so what I wanted to do was go to the source and to hear from a couple of well-informed people from Sudan, how they feel about the issues surrounding this conflict. And it is a terrible conflict. And as one of my guests mentioned, it's considered both the world's worst humanitarian crisis and it's also the largest global displacement crisis.
Yes, that's a part of the story that you often don't hear. So who did you speak to for this episode?
So, Faisal, first I spoke with Raga Makawi, and she's a researcher who's published a really thorough briefing paper all about Sudan's Rapid Support Forces. This is the militia that at one time was kind of the personal guard for the former president, Omar al-Bashir, but it's now actually the main force opposing the Sudanese armed forces. I also spoke with Hamid Murtada. Now, he's a former non-resident fellow at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy, but he's also a member of what is known as the Neighborhood Resistant Committees. These are grassroots groups that they sprang up during the 2019 uprising that saw the ouster of Bashir.
And what were some of your key takeaways from those conversations?
It was so interesting hearing from Hamid, who is so attuned to the nuances of some of the key issues in the conflict. And that, of course, is thanks to his participation in this very localized political action that we talked about earlier on. So he pointed out, for example, that while civilians are trying or typically seen as supporting either the RSF or the Sudanese armed forces, that as much as a result of the conflict, it's also a cause, as there are really severe ramifications. That's if you fail to demonstrate your support for whichever authority holds the power in the area that you live in. And I think one of Raga's final points is so important to bear in mind, which is that it's not possible to make appeals to the international community to help stop the violence, even if it was motivated to do so, because this is actually a regional war. You actually have regional actors deeply involved in the violence.
All right, well, I'm looking forward to listening.
Thanks, Faisal. Here's this week's episode of Global Insights on the Lead. Raga, thank you very much for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So it's been 2 years since Sudan pulled into this devastating war. And for some of us who have been watching from the outside, it's really easy to lose sight of the human cost behind the big headlines we're reading about. So I want to start by asking you, what does this moment feel like for the Sudanese people? And I'm referring to those inside the country and those in exile. What do you hear? What do you see? What do you carry with you from what's happening on the ground?
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for starting the question on Sudan's second anniversary by centering, the plight of the people. That's not usually the way that the narrative goes. I think Sudanese people in general at an all kind of high moment of, not just vulnerability, right? But that kind of a reoccurring nightmare. Those courts in Sudan, in the crisis on the ground in Sudan, have to contend with a lot, right? It's not just the insecurity. It's not the lack of access to any form of basic services, markets, healthcare, food. It's also the fact that they are caught in the crosshairs of both belligerents, depending on where you end up in the, carved up territory. If you're in an RSF area, then you have to be, aligned with them or to them, or the cost could be your life. If you are in a SAP, an army area, then, you are expected to fall back behind the national army line. And in between, right, all of that, the degree of social polarization in between members of the Sudanese public is also at an all-time high, depending on your position, your political position at some point in your life, maybe even your class, your ethnic background, where you live. You are associated, whether you like it or not, whether it's real or not, you are associated with one fighting force or the other. And the cost of that in the long run is massive. It's quite catastrophic, because we're not just seeing the decimation of Sudan in real time, we're also seeing the social and political disintegration of a society, because you're either for or against whatever is happening.
Okay. Now, what shape has the violence taken over the past 2 years? And we'll look at both areas, those controlled by the RSF and those controlled by SAF.
But every type of violence that you can imagine, the accusations leveled against the RSF about how they, develop these detention campaigns where they hold on to members of the public for no reason, right? I mean, it could be something as basic as because you look of a certain tribe, right? Or you could be marked as problematic and held within these detention centers for some have been held since the war began for 2 years. And there is no form, right, of prisoner maintenance or welfare, right? Especially the RSF. I mean, SAF already having run the Sudanese state for decades, do maintain prisons, and they have some sort of protocol. But with the RSF, I mean, a lot of the concerns or a lot of the accusations that came out were that they were just holding people, they weren't feeding them, they were torturing them, they were forcing them to do work, right? I mean, it was indentured labor, basically. And this is especially has become exposed in areas that SAP has managed to take over forcefully from the RSF, right? They went into these mass detention centers, they released some of the people. There's huge reports about numbers of deaths. There's also a tendency by both parties to also execute people or bury them alive. I mean, that was quite prominent. It was an established practice in places like Al Jazeera. The RSF also have a reputation for using rape as a weapon of war. A few reports by Amnesty have come out about the level and scale of targeting of Sudanese women, right? It's quite horrific. And even now, right, I mean, at the stage that we're in, both the parties are bombing each other's areas, right? They're not bombing military installations, they're bombing civilian kind of residential spaces, especially targeting markets. And the cost of this is the continued death of civilians. So I would say that both parties, both belligerents, have committed human rights atrocities. They've committed crimes against the civilians in Sudan.
And I've seen one of your recent reports entitled A Portrait of the Rapid Support Forces at War. And basically, you've explained to us what's happening on the ground with the RSF. They've existed for much longer than just the civil war. Can you give us a really brief overview of how and why the militia came into being and what their relationship was like with the former president, Omar al-Bashir?
So, yeah, basically the reason why we did this mapping of the Khartoum territory specifically, right? We wanted to understand, Khartoum being the capital in a country that's historically been ultra centralized. All of the wealth of Sudan is accumulated in the capital. The RSF, as you had mentioned, it is a fighter force, but it's more than that, right? It's long-term relationship with the Sudanese kind of Islamic regime, right, with Bashir. It was created as a medium, not just of fighting rebels in the periphery, but also as a medium of economic control in places like Darfur, right, where the state couldn't kind of enter. And so the RSF actually came to Khartoum with a wealth of governance knowledge. They knew how to twin violence with economic control.
But one thing that stood out in your paper is how the RSF's recruitment has made existing ethnic and class divisions worsen. How is the militia using these divisions to stay in control? And what is that doing to the very social fabric of Sudan?
Well, I mean, again, they've not invented this, right? I mean, they've basically taken on the Sudanese state model. The Sudanese state model has historically kind of, maintained a hierarchy of wealth, but also military power. You had to be of a certain ethnic background, right, to feature in the upper echelons of the Sudanese political class. You had to be of a certain, ethnic background to be, a prominent member or leading member or some of the military itself. And in Darfur, the long 20-year war, right, was fought by the state through proxies. The state would selectively choose a particular kind of tribe that has a grievance against another tribe, and they would weaponize their grievance by, arming one group against the other. So again, it is truly to form that the RSF is, as the Sudanese say, is born out of the womb of the Sudanese army, Sudanese National Army. It has employed very successfully all of its tactics. And so, yes, in Darfur and elsewhere, they are recruiting people because they do need fighters. But also, obviously, in the hierarchy, you would, depending on your background, you will feature in the hierarchy depending on your ethnic background. But more so, the RSF is capitalizing on the historical grievances within Sudan to also recruit people. So one of the strongest narratives that the RSF kind of, employ is that we are here to liberate the Sudanese people off the yoke of the Arab rule that has been in place since the 50s. Of course, this is a misleading narrative because it is the RSF as well who are now killing people in Al-Fashir, right? And, the Darfuris, the people of Al-Fashir, especially the Zaghawa, they are historically kind of marginalized Black minorities.
So I'm interested to know more about the man who's at the head of the RSF, Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, otherwise known as Hamid. What are his motivations, and basically how is he seen in Sudan, the country as a whole?
I mean, Hamid's, story is not different from other peripheral men, right, who have risen to power because of opportunity and violence. I think perhaps he had the better chance of being positioned and obviously kind of developments in Sudan also kind of serving his agenda, where he, over the span of only 10 years, he moved from being a border guard force to being situated very close to al-Bashir, right? I mean, the RSF forces and Hemeti have been in Khartoum for the last 10 years. And when Bashir fell, right, that became an opportunity because the Sudanese army has for a while, right, because the Sudanese state doesn't have any money. For the longest time, the struggle of the Sudanese state to maintain kind of control over the many kind of parts of Sudan that were all in conflict with it, and the fact that it didn't have any money to fight its own wars, it had to parcel out these military contracts out to people like Hemeti, who actually, because they ran military offensive as a business, they actually made a lot of money from it. So Hemeti also benefited from regional wars, right? I mean, his rise is particularly predicated on the Yemen war, the fact that the Gulf, they were hiring mercenaries, and he managed to get a lot of contracts and also serve as a recruiter for a lot of young Darfuris, right, who didn't have any other means of income or any kind of, economic prospects, other than becoming a hired gun for, external forces. Obviously, that was all done in liaison with the army, right? It was the army that kind of parceled out these external contracts to Hemeti. So again, all of these kind of different, factors, all these different developments internally, domestically, and in the region fostered his fast rise. He became a very successful businessman, residing of an empire of violence very quickly.
So you've painted a picture of how he rose to this position that he's in. Now, if we look at today, really, what is the real machinery that's propping him up? Is it guns? Is it gold? Or is there more to this? And how has the international community, knowingly or not, helped to legitimize the RSF at any point in this war?
Well, I mean, both things, right, to propel him. Guns, gold, livestock, I mean, whatever productive sectors in Sudan, especially related to the Darfur region, he definitely has his hands in. And again, let's not forget that before the war, that he has been in business with the Sudanese state for more than 10 years. So he has large-scale investments, both in Khartoum and in Darfur. He acts as a medium, extracting and then delivering into the metropoles, whether it was in Khartoum, whether it was in the region. Obviously, the international community did know for a very long time what the RSF was about. I mean, the RSF were not created overnight. These are the same people, the Janjaweed, who were implicit in the atrocities of the 2014 Darfur genocide. They might have gotten a makeover because Bashir kind of, brought them to Khartoum, dressed them up as uniformed soldiers, and gave them a constitutional title. But they are the same, right? It is the same kind of form, right, that emerged out of these proxy wars that the state funded indirectly. Now, the international community did know this. I mean, just what happened in 2019 when Bashir fell and then Sudan was transitioning. Hamid was very much right at the helm of the transitional process. And he was standing alongside and shoulder to shoulder with someone like Hamdouk. And there was no pushback, right? I mean, even though the Sudanese people refused and kind of signed this refusal with ongoing protests between 2019 until the coup in 2022. So there is a degree of complacency and complicity about the involvement of a warlord in Sudan's transitional projects. And of course, the international community also has a direct stake in this. I mean, the whole kind of migration agenda, because Hemeti rose to fame, as a border guard. His role as a guarantor, right, of controlling trafficking routes between Africa and Europe, right, was of prime importance to the international community. And so perhaps at some point they saw him as an ally, and they didn't realize that things could get this bad, but they did get this bad.
And then finally, do you feel like the world has already moved on from Sudan? And I'm talking about the world watching what's happening in the country. And what would actually shift international attention in Sudan? More violence or something else?
I don't know if the world works this way. I mean, there isn't any violence more extreme than what's happening in Gaza, right? I mean, it doesn't seem to stop the world. I don't know if, when we say the world has moved on from Sudan, Sudan is like a forgotten war, these terms are good to describe, in the media. They're good to describe, I don't know, maybe kind of to push some sort of, or to provide some sort of kind of moral relief. But even if that was not the case, even if the world wanted to engage seriously with Sudan, what would they do, right? This is not an internal conflict. This is a regional conflict that involves some of the heaviest emerging hegemonies, right? This is actually a global turf fight that's just been fought at this moment in Sudan. So who would really intervene on behalf of the dispossessed Sudanese? And for what purpose? I don't think the world works this way.
Raga, thank you very much for your insights.
Sure.
That was Raga Makawi. I was also joined in this episode by Hamid Murtada, a former non-resident fellow at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy, and also a member of one of Sudan's grassroots neighborhood resistance committees. Hamid, thank you very much for joining us on Global Insights.
Thank you so much for having me.
So now you've been a member of the neighborhood resistant committees, and they really sprung up during the popular uprising against the rule of Omar al-Bashir. Now, these groups have helped to coordinate activists across the country. Just tell me what the committees were trying to achieve in that earlier period and how their aims have developed since the outbreak of this war 2 years ago.
Right. So the resistance committees, in many ways, are an expression and a reflection of the change in the democratic imaginary and the political imaginary of youth in Sudan. How they are feeling a lot more comfortable and they feel a lot more useful expressing their politics and being a lot more political and active outside conventional political groups like political parties and traditional civil society and so on. And from that, in addition to the oppression of the regime of Omar al-Bashir that ruled the country for 30 years, they felt the need of establishing these alternative political spaces in their neighborhoods. So it started in a few neighborhoods, and then other neighborhoods got inspired until it spread across the country, with thousands of neighborhood resistance committees across Sudan coordinating their work together throughout the revolution to coordinate protests and coordinate their demands in many ways, but also to develop shared political visions for how they imagine Sudan would be ruled. After the political transition or the democratic transition of the country was kind of obstructed by the military coup that the Sudanese Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces paramilitary jointly orchestrated in 2021, the resistance committees were at the forefront of also resisting that military coup to the extent that the military partners were not able to establish a government after they orchestrated the coup. Up to the time the war erupted in April 2023, they were not still unable to establish a government. And that shows the strength of these resistance committees. Obviously, after the war erupted in April 2023, these committees remained active, but the priorities have shifted to the humanitarian front. The war has led to a very dire humanitarian situation on the ground in Sudan, making Sudan the largest humanitarian crisis in the world and the largest the world has ever seen in the past 4 decades. So something of a massive scale. So the resistance committees immediately changed their priorities and became more active on the humanitarian front, as I mentioned, and that kind of led to the emergence of the emergency response rooms, which are in many ways the offsprings of the resistance committees, who are now leading the humanitarian work on the ground, almost single-handedly shouldering it.
Okay, so talking about the humanitarian crisis, could you paint a picture for us and tell us what's happening on the ground currently?
It's a very grim picture. So, as just mentioned, Sudan is now the world's largest humanitarian crisis. But it's not only the humanitarian crisis. There are multiple crises within the crisis. Sudan is the largest displacement crisis, with 13 million people being uprooted and displaced from their homes, whether internally within the country or externally. But the vast majority is displaced internally. And internal displacement is a very big crisis in itself, because in Sudan, most of the services and most of the state institutions were centralized in Khartoum, the capital of the country. And this war started to begin with in Khartoum, the capital of the country. So you had immediately most of the services and state institutions out of service and being inaccessible from the first week of the war. At the moment, more than 80% of Sudan's healthcare service centers are inaccessible or damaged completely. So healthcare is out of the window. Most of the children in Sudan, 9 million, have not had access to schools for the past 2 years or so, ever since the war erupted. And there's a looming famine unfolding in the country, with half of the country facing acute hunger crisis and with famine being declared in 10 areas across Sudan. And you name it, a crisis after crisis, making it very multifaceted and very complex, with so many layers for why it's a very difficult situation on the ground. Yet, on the other hand, the humanitarian response is very slow. Humanitarian funding has not been allocated with sufficient funding. Most of the international aid agencies have left the country after the war erupted. So grassroots groups like the emergency response rooms and other mutual aid response groups are shouldering the response on the ground, mostly relying on transfers from the Sudanese diaspora across the world.
Just picking up on that, you've painted a very gloomy picture when it comes to the humanitarian crisis in the country. And you've also told us about the work that the Neighborhood Resistant Committee is doing to curb this humanitarian crisis. But talk a little bit about the international aid agencies. I know you do say that they have left the country. Who else is helping in this situation?
So, I mean, just to establish a picture of how the international humanitarian response to Sudan is looking like at the moment. So, the 2025 humanitarian response plan for Sudan, coordinated by the UN and where all the funding from the international donors should go and so on. At the moment, it calls for around $4 billion in funding to address the situation in Sudan. Only 6% of that is funding at the moment. And, this scant level of funding shows you the response, how it's looking like. Then, obviously, the other problem is that most of this funding goes to UN agencies that are either not present inside Sudan or present in safe areas in Port Sudan and other areas where the country is safe, it's relatively safe. You have very few international organizations on the ground. There are areas where MSF, Doctors Without Borders, are operating. There are areas where the Norwegian Refugees Council are operating, and there are areas where other international organizations operating, mostly safer areas and so on. But in the most affected areas that are affected by the conflict the most, only a couple of international organizations are present because of safety and security concerns. And what they do in most cases is that they try to channel these resources to mutual aid groups on the ground, like the emergency response rooms. However, they're still being underfunded in many ways, but also they're not being offered the same level of protection that international aid agencies are offered. They're not being treated as humanitarian workers on the ground. Meanwhile, everything that they're doing is providing humanitarian aid. So, yes, there's almost no one on the ground other than local mutual aid groups.
And still looking at aid, how has the sweeping cuts to American aid affected this aid provision in parts of Sudan that need it the most?
Well, it was disastrous the way the U.S. aid support was suddenly suspended overnight. Essentially, U.S. aid was one of the very first organizations to provide support to the mutual aid groups on the ground by removing a lot of the bureaucratic kind of hurdles that have stopped other donors from providing that kind of support. So in that way, the US aid was quite a pioneer in that sense in the Sudanese context. And to have that money go overnight has been quite disastrous because there's a lot of funding that is now not going into the country anymore. So these groups are not being able to do the work that they used to do with the support they were getting from US aid and so on. But also it kind of this signal to other donors who are trying to follow on the US aid steps that, okay, you can forget about that. If the USA did it and then they stopped, so we can also ignore it and not begin it to begin with. But also another very dangerous implication on the ground. So with the USAID funding with scale quite big in terms of the level of funding that was going to groups on the ground, that has made the emergency response rooms and other mutual aid groups on the ground very much exposed and under spotlight. And people now know these people and their faces and their names. And these are the people who were responding on the ground. And the work has become bigger with US aid funding. So they became even more well known. And now the funding has gone, but they're still well known. And everyone knows who these people are. So they become subject to targeting of the warring factions without any sort of support at the moment because USAID kind of stopped and withdrew. And we have seen how both warring factions, the Rapid Support Forces, the paramilitary, and also the Sudanese armed forces have continued to target aid providers, especially those associated with the emergency response rooms on the ground. And now more of that targeting has been taking place ever since USAID funding was cut.
So now, who controls access to humanitarian aid in this war? And just expand for us about how this aid is being used, or is it blocked?
Sure. So both warring factions have been using aid and obstructing aid for political purposes and using aid as part of weaponizing aid basically against citizens on the ground. But before I get there, I think it's also important to note how, there's a big question of legitimacy in Sudan. In 2021, the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces jointly orchestrated a coup which overthrew the transitional government of Sudan that came after the revolution. So ever since October 2021 and up until the war erupted and up to date, there's been a constitutional vacuum and a legitimacy question in Sudan about who is the state. There is no legitimate government in the country. However, the Sudanese armed forces have been claiming to represent the state and claiming to be the legitimate government despite not having any sort of constitutional basis for these claims. Unfortunately, a lot of international aid organizations, including the UN, have been affording and allowing that claim to fly and allowing SAF, the Sudanese Armed Forces, to become the de facto state and to have that legitimacy as a state. And that has led them to continue manipulating this legitimacy that they have as the state and to allow or deny aid access depending on their advancement on the battlefield and what they would like to gain politically. So what has been happening is that the Sudanese armed forces will not allow the access of humanitarian aid supplies into areas that are controlled by the rapid support forces, in many ways collectively punishing every Sudanese citizen that is being forced to live in areas controlled by the rapid support forces, and vice versa. The rapid support forces are not allowing aid access into the Sudanese armed forces controlled areas. So both of them are obstructing the access of humanitarian aid. But they've also been using humanitarian access, as a card for negotiations and to bring it on the table as part of potential peace talks and allow it when they want to see or get something from the international community and deny it when they're not interested anymore. So it's been definitely part of how they are fighting this war.
Okay. So earlier we heard from our previous guest, Raga Makawi, about the ambitions of Sudan's political elites. Now, just tell me, at the grassroots level, how do people feel about this conflict?
So this conflict has been very confusing and very polarizing for people on the ground. In one way, having the dreams and the aspirations of democracy that came after the revolution crushed first by the military coup, but then by the war like that has been quite frustrating for people. But also the gap and the absence of leadership on the political side has been also quite frustrating. The grassroots groups, the way they operate, they needed a bit more time to kind of develop structures and to figure out a way where they would remain true to their grassroots and to remain connected and to remain oriented towards the grassroots and to be guided by that as a principle, meanwhile being able to also move and mobilize on the national level and to be able to engage a lot more effectively on a central state level, if you will. However, that time was not possible because of the coup and the war and so on, which kind of leaves these groups in a very vulnerable situation where they are still developing, they're still figuring out how to maneuver such context, meanwhile making sure that they continue to reject the conventional politics of the old political club, as they would call it, meaning by that the political elites who have been governing the country ever since independence, even, coordinating with military leaders at some times, but also working without them at some other times. So there's been a complete rejection of that old political club. However, it's a very difficult situation to be tested like that, having a war where you need to respond and where you need to be active and where you need to kind of represent the aspirations and the demands of the people on the ground. Meanwhile, you're still developing and figuring out how to operate in such a context.
Yeah, that's interesting because Raga was also telling us about this huge pressure in the areas controlled by the RSF as well as those controlled by the Sudanese armed forces. There's so much pressure on these people to support those respective forces. Now, I'd like to find out from you, are there still groups on the ground that are able to stay non-aligned?
So it's very difficult, but they are. And I mean, a lot of the alignment that we have seen was quite tactical and temporary, where groups on the ground are being forced to align with one of the forces or the other, and they kind of follow that as a way of to survive, basically, because otherwise you're not able to survive, you're not able to provide humanitarian aid to the communities that you represent, and so on. But throughout these very trying times of trying to either or being forced to align with this part of the over the other, there are many groups that remained non-aligned, and I think it's very difficult to judge while the war is still ongoing. I think it would be a lot easier, but also a lot more sensible to kind of look at them and figure out which groups on the ground were compromised, which ones were continued to remain non-aligned once there is a moment where there is no active fighting between warring parties and people are being caught in the crossfire.
And Sudan's army chief, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, a few weeks ago, he poured cold water on the idea of a transition to civilian rule. He was saying that those who fought in the conflict should be given priority in a future government. So now, how does that reflect the aspirations of the Sudanese people across the country?
I mean, it was him, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, who obstructed and who crushed the democratic aspirations and the democratic transition of the country in the first place. Throughout the 2 years of the transition after the transitional government was sworn in 2019, and until he, with the Rapid Support Forces, committed or orchestrated the coup in 2021, he continued to obstruct the demands of the Sudanese people every day. He continues to do so up to date. So I am very sure that Abdel Fattah al-Burhan has nothing to offer for the Sudanese people with regards to their democratic demands.
And finally, Hamid, 2 years into this war with so much destruction, so much displacement, in your view, what would a meaningful support for Sudan actually look like now? And I'm not just talking about support from aid agencies, but from the international community as well.
So from the international community, what is really needed is support to the civilian groups on the ground, but also those in the diaspora and those who recently became displaced from Sudan, outside Sudan, and so on, because these are the groups that have a lot more legitimacy. And these groups are, if the international community is trying to find peace, these are the peace partners, not the warring factions. The international community continued to work and coordinate with the warring factions even before the war erupted, essentially giving legitimacy to these actors and legitimizing their political aspirations, which is why in many ways they started this war. So to stopping this collaboration and partnership with the warring factions in many ways, and to prioritize working with civilians. And when we're thinking of and designing peace processes and political processes, it should be designed around civilian demands and around civilian groups, and then forcing the military leaders to join, not the other way around, which has been a tested and failed formula in Sudan, but also outside Sudan. So yes, I think what the international community really needs to do is to stop trusting the army leaders in Sudan and stop working with them, and choose and prioritize to work with civilian groups instead.
Hamid, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you so much.
You've been listening to Global Insights on the Lead. This week's episode was produced by Finbar Anderson and hosted by me, Kwangu Liwewe. For a deeper understanding of global news and current affairs, subscribe to The Lead on your favorite podcast app, where you'll find Global Insights the last Friday of every month.